Well, good morning. It is my honor to be able to introduce today's speaker, who is not only someone I greatly look up to, he's both a mentor and he has become a friend, both prior to my time at BYU and especially since my arrival. Dr. Narcio Garcia, or Profe Garcia, as his Latino, Latina, and Latinx students lovingly refer to him, is the Lemuel Hardison Red Jr. Professor of Western and Latino History, and he is also the current president of the Mormon Historical Association, the first person of color to hold that position. He was born in Nuevo Laredo and raised on the west side of San Antonio. He served in Vietnam from 1971 to 1972 as a medic in the Army. In fact, a quote from an interview with the Church News after his appointment to the Mormon Historical Association president, Dr. Garcia said, "The war in Vietnam taught me much about my abilities to be compassionate, understanding of others, and to make tough and unpopular decisions." He received his Bachelor's of Arts degree in journalism from Texas A&I University in 1976, and then worked as a journalist for the Tucson Citizen, covering the Civil War in El Salvador. He later received his master's in history from the University of Arizona in 1989, and later his PhD from the same institution in 1995. Prior to coming to BYU, Profe Garcia was an assistant professor in Mexican American and U.S. social history at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. He came to BYU in 1995, this making it 25 years since his arrival in the Department of History at BYU. To say he is a prolific scholar is an understatement. He has authored 7 books on his own, a feat matched by very few of his peers, not only within his own department here, but of his colleagues in his field of Chicano, Latino, and Western history. He is also the author of several recent articles on Latinos in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and is currently working on a bio of Eduardo Valderas, the first Spanish language translator for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the first Spanish-speaking patriarch. Again, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Ignacio Garcia.
Thank you very much. First, thank you, Andrew. He's a wonderful student in my 490 class, and thank you for that prayer. Thank you so much for David for that wonderful introduction. I've always said that I wish that I was as good as my introductions, but I guess none of us are really. And thank you, Dean Olgos and Professor Laura Walker, for your efforts to make this lecture possible and the work that you do to promote diversity in the college. And thank all of you for being here. As most of you are aware, 2 things have happened recently that bring into focus any discussion of diversity at BYU and the church. The first is the issue with the Sunday school manual that repeated some racially insensitive concepts that were once taught as doctrine. And the other, of course, are the question in comments directed to panelists on the Black and Immigrants Forum of a few days back. Both highlight the need for Latter-day Saints to think deeply and long on the issues of race and diversity. We are not a hotbed of racism or a desert when it comes to diversity. We are better than that. At the same time, we are no paradise of diversity, and racism does rear its head more than we wish. Students are told to stop speaking Spanish, to go back to their countries. People of color are blamed for their poverty and their misfortune, and the need to build walls and restrict immigrations are discussions chaired in our dorm rooms, classrooms, hallways, and cafeterias. And while we have yet to see it, blatant public intolerance is rising in college campuses across the nation. We are not coming together as one in our nation, and I fear that we are not doing enough on campus to bring us together as one, or as I like to say, make us whole. Here, there is much to be happy with. Our students are respected for the most part, and we emphasize religious values and provide our students a good education. Yet I see a greater discontent among students of color and among some female students than I've seen since I've been here. This generation, some of you, many of you, BYU students have lived in a nation much more concerned with social justice, with the environment, with the equality of all men and women, and with the notion that we can all share in the bounty of this affluent society. Of course, alongside, there is a cohort nurtured in a home and social environment of fear, distrust, fake news, and victimization. We have an incredibly divided nation, and no doubt that the incident that occurred in that panel discussion is a reflection of that. It is also a reflection of how, as a nation, a church, and a university, we struggle with the notions of diversity and inclusion. I fear we misunderstand some of the fundamentals of what it means to nurture diversity, and we don't always recognize what are the legacies of our own Latter-day Saint mistakes of the past. Students of color and female students often tell me that people here do not always understand their concerns, and often they are told they have to adjust and conform. They find too often that they have nowhere to turn to, not because people aren't sympathetic, but because people find it difficult to understand them. As seen by the letter of one white student who blamed the problems of the comments of the panel on a few people and indirectly on the students of color for having the audacity to protest their treatment. When we individualize acts of racism or discrimination, we lose sight of how societal or institutional actions and structures encourage and nurture our wrong attitudes. I'd like to speak to a number of issues which I hope will help us understand what have been our challenges to implement diversity and inclusion, and how often we fail to understand those who are different. In the Vietnam War film, Full Metal Jacket, a rather violent and mostly inappropriate movie for most BYU students, there is a scene, one of only two that I've ever watched the film, when two Army journalists are confronted by a commander of a platoon of American soldiers who senses that they are skeptical of the American mission in the country. Getting in their faces, he barks out, "Inside every South Vietnamese is an American waiting to come out." It is a hilarious moment due to the ridiculous nature, but it's also reflective of a common misperception by those who fear diversity and those who yearn for it. And that is that for people of color to come into their own, they have to somehow become like the norm, which often means to think and act like the dominant group in American society. Our whole notion of assimilation is not that people of color, and women for that matter, will come to be part of a whole, but that they will be indistinguishable from the whole itself. They will think and act, they will want the same things, and nothing except the color and the gender of the whole will change, and then only slightly. Then we can promote the notion of color blindness and that gender doesn't really matter in important issues. Oftentimes, these ideas reflect an attempt to be fair and to be inclusive. Unfortunately, that is not the way it works when we become inclusive and diverse within our ranks. Things do change, and they can be disruptive, and cause us to adjust and to be patient and to learn to see things differently. But I would argue that these changes are mostly for the better. They not only stretch us, but they make us whole. And as Latter-day Saints, we should seek to be one as our prophet has exhorted us to be. Yet we continue not to be one. More than 50 years after the start of affirmative action and after a multiplicity of programs and initiatives to integrate people of color into our society, a large gap still exists between whites and people of color in terms of economics, employment, social status, graduation rates, and we can add that with women too. Only recently, a report by the Latino faculty at the University of Texas pointed out that despite all the affirmative action programs and efforts to make the university sensitive to people of color, Latino faculty are paid less, promoted less often, and their influence at the university remains limited. They remain the other within its campus. In the corporate world, we hear that companies are hiring diversity and equal opportunity officers by the bunches. And yet many of these same individuals complain that they are marginalized, that their opinions and their statistics are seen as inconvenient truths, even as their companies boast about their efforts to bring equity to the workplace. Said one of those officers recently, hiring a diversity officer, quote, "hiring a diversity officer won't fix a racist company culture," end quote, and in fact may simply exacerbate the situation as others resist diversity, see its inclusion and as an affront to them, or simply find it as another burden to confront in the workplace. Many will often ask, why can't minorities just do their job? Why are they so sensitive? Don't they know we hire only the best regardless of color? And of course, the daddy of them all. Why should I pay for the sins of the past since I don't discriminate? My desire today is not to provide answers to these questions because they've been answered so many times before and rarely has it made a difference. Instead, I want to speak about something that has been often burdened my heart, and that is why we, Latter-day Saints, have a diversity problem, why we are still not whole as a people, and what we need to think about here at Brigham Young University to make this a Zion University and to prepare students for a world that continues to struggle with these issues. It is apparent from our history that we saints turned a universal gospel, for a time, into one that privileged one group or others. We didn't begin this process, but we added to it and became unwittingly the poster children of whiteness. So much so that the most recent Latter-day Saint politician to run for president, and who's shown a lot of moral strength recently, came to be known as the whitest person to ever run for the nation's highest office. While other institutions have battled over diversity or engaged in profound discussions about what it means to have a constituency that represents the nation as a whole, here we often pray for it, hoping that the Lord will deliver it to us in a silver platter. For people who don't believe that God works that way, sometimes we have acted as if he did. I don't have to be reminded of how many committees and entities have been formed to deal with that issue. And by the way, I want to offend the people who are really engaged in that effort, because there are some, and I will mention that later, who are really committed to the issue. But how many words have been spoken about the need for diversity at BYU? I remember the first time I was appointed to a diversity committee here at the Y. Really happy, I literally ran over to see my colleague, another Latino who ran the International Student Office, and asked him to join me. He rolled his eyes, smiled, pointed to an old file cabinet, and said, there are over 18 diversity committee reports there that I helped write. No, thank you. Nothing will come of it. Was he cynical? He may have been, but he was partly right. That was over 20 years ago. My thoughts and words sometimes harsh against what I see as the lack of diversity here at the Y, or however, as it is for many students and faculty of color, encased within a love of this institution and an unwavering faith to the church to which it belongs. It is that love and faith that has made me and others come back to this well repeatedly. I know that it is the love for the gospel that often troubles students and faculty of color who wonder why are we not at the forefront of change. The one naive thought that many have, and I think particularly people of color who come from outside the BYU faculty, is that in the church and at the Y, all things become right. We think that, as the Reverend Martin Luther King once said, it is always the right time to do the right. Put in more plebeian terms, we believe that prophetic people should know better. I'm sorry. For me, BYU is like a forest, a tropical rainforest at that, in which not only the trees, but the plants, the animals, the insects, the soil, the wind, and the sun all play a part of it to make it a living ecosystem. There's a place for all those elements, and lacking one or two of them hampers the whole forest. I can't speak to the science of the rainforest, but I have little doubt that all the elements that make it such a place came together little by little, each finding accommodation with the other and eventually learning to balance their needs with those of the other parts of the forest. The church in BYU can also be a forest, where all its members or students find their place and there's balance among us. In that human forest, we can see the contribution of each saint, we can come to learn how each experience adds to the whole and how these experiences enlarge the knowledge and strength of whom we are. In this ecosystem we call our campus and our church, there's a place for each one of us, and we face no pecking order, no foreordained group to lead, and no one left to wait until the appropriate time. In creating that forest, we have to move beyond shallow multicultural celebrations and symbolic acknowledgments, and to seek more than artificial reconciliation. We need to challenge ideas and structures that privilege one group over another. In that forest, we will not have a young black woman sitting on the floor of her room, dreading the next day when she will have to go to class, feeling that some of her classmates see her as inferior because of the color of her skin. It will have the space and the shade in which students will find a safe space in which to gather and refresh their passions and dreams. And among the trees, flowers, and bushes, we will not find fine young men who, as soon as they graduate, will run out of this forest and never look back, maybe following their own highly successful parents who did the same many years earlier. And in this forest, no young woman will be told to speak English when conversing with a friend, or told to go back to where she came from, because the forest, BYU, will be her home while she learns. But why is it that for many students of color, women, and numerous others, the forest seems so barren, sometimes hostile, and too often lonely? I think it is because of legacies that we confront here and at the Y and in the church. Our dilemma comes from having lived what I call the doctrine of Ephraim. And here's where I get in trouble with my church historian friends and my ancient scripture colleagues, but bear with me. The doctrine of Ephraim, and what Protestant scholars used to call the Ephraim's teaching, a now discredited Protestant doctrine that argued that Jews had lost the right to be called the house of Israel, and that Christians now held that honor, and with that honor came the full blessings of heaven to them before all others. The prophet Joseph did not promote or even believe this doctrine per se, but he did at first teach that those who were converted to the church were actually descendants of Ephraim, the son of Joseph of Egypt. In other words, Latter-day Saints were actually finding the Ephraim needle in the world's haystack as they spread the gospel. This theological concept would expand to see the descendants of Ephraim as those responsible for the gathering of Israel, and thus the first to receive the blessings of the gospel and to become its leaders. This theological interpretation became problematic when seen in the context of bringing all of God's children to Christ, when the last could be first and the first could be last. It became even more so when the gospel message resonated with more than Americans and European saints. There was at that moment an opportunity to reject these notions of some privileged above others. But before the church could clarify its teachings, the preeminence of Ephraim among God's children, Brigham Young declared that the Anglo-Saxon race were the pure Ephraimites, thus providing a racial element to the prophetic teachings and making those members considered white as the first and most significant beneficiaries of the blessings of the gospel. The scriptural references to the descendants of Ephraim's role in the gathering reveal no racial connotations, and in a sense seem to support Joseph's view of the descendants of Ephraim as simply those who accepted the gospel. Brigham Young's teachings, however, would be one of many American strains of racialism, or some would call racism, that permeated the 19th, 20th, and 20th century. And let me say that recently a black area authority from Africa said that he was sure that Brother Brigham had already learned this lesson in heaven and was now with the program. Brigham Young's teachings, however, would be one of many strains of racialism or racism. The church would enter a period in which racial genealogy became fundamental to its teachings, and we became mired in false teachings like the priesthood and temple ban for black saints, and a host of other unsubstantiated stories of racial differences that applied in one form or another to most people of color. And that resulted in the furthering of a genealogical pecking order and timeline based on race and sometimes codified by patriarchal blessings that place white members, all of them whom were assigned, most of them who were assigned to the tribe of Ephraim, at the top of the Latter-day Saint totem pole. Over time, this genealogical pecking order disrupted the unity of the church family, and others seeing their place in the kingdom dependent on their complexion and their genealogy, if not theologically, sure in practice. In patriarchal blessings, those with lighter skin or simply white became of the tribe of Ephraim, and their darker siblings were of Manasseh. There are, of course, other tribes, as a colleague of mine reminded me just yesterday, but Ephraim's preeminence remained. Now, I don't want you to be disappointed with your patriarchal blessings. Patriarchal blessings were meant to adopt us into the house of Israel, to make sure that we were part of the family. But, and the actual tribe really doesn't matter. As you will find in today, some patriarchal blessings given without an assignment to a tribe. It is just a way to all of the part of it. The belief that those white Ephraimites were chosen above all of other God's children seeped into the hymns, firesides, missionary discussions, and seminary lessons, sometimes overt and at other times meshed with discussions of the blessings of membership in the kingdom and promises that awaited collectively in some distant bright future. Yet no matter how these teachings were taught, they privileged one group over another and did so based on skin, color, and genealogy. Many who came to uphold these teachings were not always themselves racist or even racially insensitive. In fact, many felt a discomfort, and of course some left the church over this white privileging. But those who stayed simply prayed for the time when we as a people became whole, and in their daily lives, they tried to make this so. Still, many of them unwittingly affirmed that it was God's will when criticized and attacked, as we all are, both within and without the church. Their waiting for God to change things eventually became disturbing to some saints of color and ended up having to make up things. I, as a young man, remember having to make up things when my friends challenged me for belonging to that racist church, and I still regret ever having said the things that I've said. I remember a young Latino returned missionary sitting in my office, sadly recounting how his mission president had privileged his white companions over him during a district conference. Unable to see this missionary of color because he sat right below the podium, the president leaned forward and told the missionaries in a loud whisper that they were blessed because they were white and of the tribe of Ephraim. Teaching faithful, believing white saints this doctrine of Ephraim had the effect of making some of them uncomfortable and often distrustful of people of color who demanded their right in the public arena or wanted to know why they were seen as second-class citizens within the kingdom. Latter-day Saints, in spite of our gospel of love, came to be less than loving to many who were different from them. Even today, we see the discomfort as evidenced by our student who dismissed the aforementioned incident. If teaching white saints the doctrine of Ephraim was wrong, teaching it to saints of color was almost insidious, even when not meant to be. Some of us here know saints of color who believe, though not acknowledge publicly, that they will become white and delightsome through righteous livings. Or others, like a Peruvian brother, who cannot wait until the resurrection so they can rise up tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. And it has also led, it is funny, but it has also led to recrimination by saints of color against their own people for carrying what can only be called the curse of color. I can only imagine what it has been for women saints of color, though I got a small glimpse of it once during a ward activity. A white member of our ward was taking a picture of our Boy Scout troop when one of the black Dominican sisters, pointing to her quite handsome son, said, "Can you make him look a little whiter?" Yes, some would argue rightfully that this is the effects of colonialism and racism, principally. But imagine the added burden of believing in a pecking order in the gospel. Some say it is an outdated ideal, but I remember vividly sitting in a sacrament meeting late last year, singing a hymn in Spanish that spoke to the promises to Ephraim in a chapel full of people assigned mostly to the tribe of Manasseh. Nothing for us in that beautiful song but the reminder that we were not Ephraimites. Now, lest I lose you before I get to my main points, I acknowledge and affirm and believe that the church has completely rejected all of these theories of color as a reflection of righteousness and denounced them as racist. Unfortunately, did not denounce the opposite, and that is that whiteness is not some sign of righteousness in the pre-existence, where the rest of us sat on the fences. Those who have seen President Russell Nelson's ministry can rejoice in his teaching that all men and women are sons and daughters of a Heavenly Father and thus equal here and in the eternities. I've learned how important this is when teaching my Sunday school class this past week. When I affirmed the church statement on skin color, a sister raised her hand and said to me and the class, "Thank you for that, because for most of my life, I have worried about the color of my skin." Many others nodded their heads, acknowledging how these ideas had impacted their own lives. The pseudo-religious belief that God privileges some above others has allowed many saints to become complacent about issues of race. While they might be discomforted, and undoubtedly some are not, by racial inequalities, they often chalk it up to some kind of divine timetable, believing that God will fix everything, and those complaining people will get their due sometime in the future, if not here, then in the afterlife. These teachings, while energetically denounced by the church, have left a legacy of indifference and our subtle superiority that isn't always clear, particularly to those not affected by them. Let me share some of my own experience, and I'll try to make it quicker because we're out of time, to explain what I mean. While a student activist, and please don't laugh at this other picture, in college, I had a bishop who cared for me, and then another one who liked me and thought that I could be of help in bringing back some of those Mexican saints who had left their small branch. The first, a political science professor at the university, and the second one, a biology professor in the same school. We're good men, but very different politically. One being liberal, the other conservative. One trying to understand the notion of inclusion, the other still reeling from his own difficult experience with people of color. The first one empathized with me and my struggles to reconcile my faith with my activism, while the second sought to immerse me in ward activities so as to help me forget my struggles. Both wanted me to be faithful, but neither understood what I was going through as a young man of color fighting racism in the college he attended. One bishop thought he understood my struggle, but really did not. The other one saw my struggle as a sign of misunderstanding the gospel, which it wasn't. My struggle worried one and frustrated the other. What they had in common, however, was that neither sought to ask me my thoughts or believed that I brought something to the table. One wanted to save my soul, bless his heart. And the other one wanted to correct my views of the church and social justice. He would remain a friend for many years. One saw my people as needing saving. The other believed we needed correction. One acknowledged that our being Mexican affected the way our white brothers saw us, but believed that time and attending church would fix the problem. The other one thought we were playing the race card and wished to teach us to be like the rest of the members, some who he admitted were prejudiced. They both knew what was good for me. Those of us who are different, whether male or female, know what I'm talking about. We are led, instructed, and counseled about things pertaining to us by people who don't know us and often fail to ask us what we think. Our opinions, even when sought out, often fall into an abyss as the listener has already moved on to the counseling or correcting mode. I think women know this well, and women of color would add that it's double for them. In the same ward was an old rancher, those kind of men who always seek solutions, who will fix your roof, who will always do their home teaching and do it sincerely, but often pay very little attention to the circumstances and have no time for historical perspective. For some reason, we were both there on a weekday in an empty chapel, and our conversation turned to how we could provide translation to our Spanish-speaking members. Many did not understand English, but they felt uncomfortable wearing headphones, while many of the white members complained that they could hear the translator's voice through the device, and it distracted them from the service. "I know what we can do," he said the old fellow, after talking about the issue for a few minutes. He pointed to a back section of the chapel. You know, those places where people who don't come often or who still don't feel uncomfortable mixing, sit. "We'll build an enclosed room," he said, "with a large window where they can sit, listen to the talks in Spanish, and see what's going on, and no one will be bothered." I remember smiling and changing the subject. For all my activism, I was partial to my Latter-day Saint brothers and sisters and didn't want to hurt his feelings. Still, I understood that for him and others in that ward, our space was white, and it belonged to one group, even though it had belonged to the other only recently before they felt justifiably or not pushed out. The Mexican saints were welcomed, the mean sometimes even loved, but they occupied whatever space left over, even if it resembled an aquarium or a zoo. Many years later, I arrived at Brigham Young University, joining a department with no Mexican-American scholars or scholars of color, and a college with only a handful, which is what we have to date, although we have almost two handfuls now, thanks to the work that some have done. Dean, Laura, and others. I was enthused and had the feeling that Latter-day Saints always did the right thing if they just understood the situation. I didn't think I was naive, but I was. I arrived during August, and upon arrival, heard of a major diversity conference going on, and I invited myself into one of the sessions. It did not take long to realize that what I was hearing was rather old news to me, but more interesting was the absence of any thought that the university was not doing enough. During the question and answer session, after the administrator conducting the meeting asked the rhetorical question about what we needed to do to diversify, I raised my hand with a "I can't believe you don't know" snarky tone, and told him that the literature was already out there, and it was no secret what needed to be done. The vice president acknowledged my comment, but soon moved on to other issues. I must have had this incredulous look in my face, because the same administrator came up to me after the meeting and said, "You're right, but the people here are not ready for that." Why, I thought to myself. But as most people of color do when they're surrounded by a sea of whiteness and no brown anchor to steady them, I kept it to myself. Sometime later, sensing I might be the only token brown face for a while, I asked the department chair, a man I greatly admire, what we could do to bring more faculty of color. His response, and he was a loving fellow who just took care of me very well. His response with a smile was, "Why do we want another one when we have the best one already?" As much as I tried, I could not dissuade him from the idea that you went for the best and then you claimed mission accomplished. It took 22 more years to hire 3 more scholars of color, although only 2 of them remained. My chair never understood what I was in part, that I was in part lonely because I was the only scholar of color in my department, and the students could be quite insensitive. I had no one to talk about this, at least not to someone who understood or who would not treat me like a youngster, which is something people of color and women are often made to feel as we sit there and pour out our hearts to someone who listens and then provides us the verdict. My friend and others like him were sincerely happy that a space opened up for me at this great university, but they saw no need to go beyond hiring just me. In the scheme of things, my hiring was a feather in someone's cap and maybe a blessing for the department, which I hope it was, but nothing more. I remember one incident during a meeting of one of my many diversity committee functions. As it happens when people are charged with an assignment, the imaginations go wild. And we were talking about multiple rather grandiose ideas about the recruiting of more students of color and the hiring of faculty of color, when a quiet, rather pleasant administrator said with a slightly frustrated tone, "But what about our own?" It stopped the conversation dead, and everyone turned to him. When asked what he meant, since we were only talking about LDS applicants, he replied, "You know what I mean." We didn't move him beyond that, but we all knew what he meant. For the first few meetings, this individual was fine with strategies and conversations. But when it came to concrete plans, he reacted with the belief that giving anything to people of color meant taking something away from the white students or the white faculty. A zero-sum game in his mind. And it is an idea that continues to crop up every time we talk about minority recruitment or hiring more women, etc. If they gain, we lose. In the context of society and the university, it's not an individual game, but one of groups. Given that the wonderful, and I emphasize that, wonderful man had no children ready to come to the university, he was speaking on behalf of his community and not his family. The question he was really asking is, if we let them all in or hire them for our faculty, what will happen to our children, our neighbors' children, and our brothers and sisters who want to attend here, and what will happen to the BYU of our youth? For him, it was a question of whether he was ready to give up what he was familiar with and what belonged to him and his community. Sometime earlier, in fact, one semester after I arrived, President Rex Lee fell ill and passed away. I prayed, like most of the BYU community, that we might get a good president. Then I heard the news that a general authority for the first time would ever lead the university. I was overjoyed. And with all humility, I wrote asking him to take us into the direction that would make BYU a reflection of the changing church. There was at the time this buzz over the fact that the church was becoming international and one of color. In my letter, I pled for a greater effort to diversify the student body and the university faculty. I told him that to saints across the globe, BYU was a special place, but that the university needed to begin to reflect the membership of the church. I quoted scripture and expressed my most intimate and sincere feelings of hope. I told him how grateful I was to have someone like him lead us, and felt it was the Lord's answer to many prayers. It was, I believe then, and still do today, one of the most spiritual expressions of the heart that I have ever conveyed. A week later, I received a reply. It was not a long letter, but in rather scathing, clear terms, he expressed his own views of the role of BYU in the church, and ended with the statement that he knew better, and that in 25 years, things would be radically different. I was stunned, but I had no recourse. I did not respond. Let me add that I had subsequent interactions with President Bateman after that letter, when we talked about BYU basketball. He was a basketball fanatic, and other minor issues. He even asked me for advice, inquiring me on how to keep Black faculty from leaving once they're hired. And his talk on becoming a Zion University is one that I cherish and read periodically to remember why I'm here. All of that notwithstanding, the letter revealed several things about the BYU administrative community at the time. One, the issue, though at times important, was not a priority. The president was willing to wait 25 years for any significant diversity to occur. Second, not only was diversity not a priority, but the simple discussion of it was upsetting, to use a nice word. It still is in some departments, and among some who believe that all is well in Zion. Nothing in the letter was accusatory or disparaging. It was a letter of a naive but sincere new faculty member who believed that in Zion we do things right and we don't wait a quarter of a century to start doing it. 18 years later, I asked another university president whether the aforementioned prediction was being fulfilled. His response was that while the former president was his friend, he did not remember ever having raised his hand to sustain him as a prophet, and then went on to declare unequivocally diversity was not a priority for him, BYU, or the church. Needless to say, I was stunned again, but this time so were many of my history colleagues in the room. So after waiting for almost 2 decades, the challenge went from having to wait such a long time to now having nothing to wait for. Now, why do I tell you all of these experiences? Is it to condemn these individuals? No. Some of them I admire to this day, and most of them were and are honorable people who gave a lot of themselves and given much to the university. but it's to show what people of color, women, and others confront constantly, and why it is so frustrating and so maddening. Nearly 200 years after a gospel about love and equality was revealed to a young man near Palmyra, people are still uncomfortable when we talk about diversity and the overwhelming whiteness of BYU. There is still the view that if we just wait, things will change. Making others wait, however, is a common response for people who do not face limitations in their lives. They can take their time to find solutions. They counsel patients, and they see administrative or institutional needs as more urgent than that of a particular people that need to be served. They have time to spare, don't lose sleep over it, and they often approach problems of diversity if they were just a challenge waiting for a neutral solution. Too often we the other live in a monologue, as the Reverend Martin Luther King used to say, as our voices reach out to express our frustration or plea for an acknowledgement of our challenges, but no answer comes. As the farm worker leader Cesar Chavez used to say, don't erase me and tell me to wait for my children to be better off. Few people see the urgency of our desire to see more people like us, and to feel this university as much as ours as anyone else's. It reminds me of something that I heard a commissioner of education say once when responding to a question of diversity in the church schools. I do not understand, he said, why the Lord gives to those who have, meaning why some students get preference at BYU. But that is the way it is, he added. The Lord, not BYU, will take care of the rest, end of quote. I'm just not sure the Lord wants that job. He expects us to construct the forest, to use the resources and the know-how already here. We have to plant the seeds, nurture the flowers and bushes, feed the animals, and pray for the rain and sun. We are the tillers with this help for the future forest. So what must we do to make this a better place for people of color, women, and others? I didn't come here to provide a roadmap. I think there are a number of wonderful people in different places at the Y who are trying their best to do that now, and who are much better at talking about the strategies than I am. I would rather talk about what I call a vision for wholeness and a re-engagement with our values and our commitment that all are equal unto God. I hope that if one of you here is there, I didn't mean to just put you up there, but I couldn't find another picture. I think we start by believing what we often promote, and that is that BYU should be a Zion university, which would mean not an American university, not a profession or vocation-focused university, not a big-time sports university, not a place where we train the next generation of political and economic plutarchs, and finally, not the university that favors one group over another. Many of the goals of the university would be fulfilled through a real Zion university. Students will get trained and educated to find good jobs. They will learn much about the nation's role in the restoration. They might even win a few sports titles, and some of them might even become influential political and economic figures. But all of those will be secondary to becoming a place where all of God's children have the same possibilities and are not limited by their race, their economic situation, their gender differences, or their familial preparation. It would be a place that reflected somewhat the church demography. Would it take time to accomplish this? Yes, but I've spent 25 years of my life waiting for it. And Enoch Flores spent 30 years of his life waiting for it. And Fernando Gomez has spent 50 years waiting. And we could probably mention others who have waited even longer. Investing in change, regardless of how long it takes, is a worthy goal. BYU should be a place where students will be empowered to speak to social, economic, religious, familial, and environmental justice, but not a political, ideological justice, but one centered on the gospel message that we are all God's children of heavenly parents who don't have a pecking order or a varied timetable for their children to progress or well-being. It should be a place where students find their personal identity while recognizing that of others, where we know that everyone is here, that everyone here is already home and don't need to go back anywhere. All of us must be engaged in this effort: students, faculty, staff, and administrators. As faculty members, we must envision our classrooms in places where our students learn to navigate a much larger and complex world, where everyone sees each other as important and from which to learn, and where we can learn to confront a world reeling with hate, bigotry, inequality, and secularism that sees no need for moral values. We need to ask ourselves, are our classes, assignments, oral presentations preparing us students for the or preparing the students for the world to come? And I say that knowing some of my students in my class are here, and I'm sure they're thinking whether I do that. Maybe not as well. So I'm committing myself to doing that. Will they see skin color, gender, and other differences and not be discomforted? Will they embrace differences without fear or distrust? Are our students of color finding their voices, recognizing their equality within the kingdom? To students of color, women, and others, I say, you must enter every BYU space with a firm belief that you have something to offer, that your experiences matter, and so do your words and ideas. Too often, learning is one-sided, and you come out learning more about them and nothing about you. Empower yourselves by learning, by experiencing, by participating in all activities that take you out of your comfort zone, including pushing against what you see as wrong and which demeans others and you. And find mentors. You might say, there aren't enough professors of color or women to mentor me. And you're right. But all BYU professors should be and often are willing to up their game. Go tell them in no uncertain terms that you need a mentor, one willing to learn of you and of your needs. So many of these men and women who teach here, I know, will rise to the occasion. And they will learn so much more for it, and they will change your lives and yours there. But students, be mindful of one thing, and that is that you will stand on the shoulders of those who came before and engaged in their own struggles. The Native American students who made of BYU a hotbed of activism when Indian rights and advocates came from across the nation to a place they considered safe and the one place for Native Americans to come to. On the shoulders of the members of the Mexican American Club who took students to the state capitol to lobby on behalf of Utah farm workers and against the short hoe, an instrument of no use in the fields except to break the backs of workers. On the shoulders of Black students who more than anyone have built safe spaces and taught their fellow students, and those in the community who listen, what it means to be proud of whom you are. And on the shoulders of female students who fought the further victimization by bureaucracy on young women who have been abused or sexually assaulted. And on the shoulders of our LGBT brothers and sisters who silently carried on with their pain, but still provided and provide today spaces and encouragement to those who are misunderstood and mistreated. To white students, I say, you're a blessed generation. Regardless of whether you're rich or poor, of pioneer stock or convert family, who feel good about yourselves or struggle as most of us do, because you are here and you're as bright as any similar cohort in the wise past. I say to you, join us in making BYU a diverse place. We don't want you to be our saviors or to tell us how to do things. Just walk beside us, and sharing our setbacks and our triumphs, you will be greatly appreciated. Administrators, department chairs, centers, institute directors, ask yourselves, whether the hiring I do, the courses that are offered, the lecturers invited, the club sponsors, and the faculty staff discussions that take in their place, do I envision something more than what my stewardship has become? And are there things happening in my place that shortchanges students and faculty of color? Do I really listen? Do I stand up for them? And in this, again, I want to thank Dean Ogos publicly, because in the recent panel controversy, he was one of the few administrators that actually spoke publicly and forcefully. Thank you again, Ben. I know many of you already do many of these things, but I think our vision to behold requires an added urgency. And let me skip to the ends because I know some of you have to leave. When Nephi wrote, and he invited them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness, and he denied none that came unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female, and all are alike unto God. He spoke to all of us who are in position to make Zion's places whole, where all of God's children are not only welcome, but are sought after. We saints are a prophetic people. We're visionaries. All things are possible to us when we rely on the Lord and follow the charge given us that we become one. BYU should and can reflect that, but it is up to us to make it happen. Thank you.